Hey, JD here. Welcome to the Mead House. You know, over the past several years, we've brought you over 150 episodes of mead making education, information, and entertainment. More than 100 guests have stopped by the Mead House, professional mead makers, medal-winning home mead makers, competition organizers, experts on yeast and honey, and brewers just like you and me have all visited to share their knowledge. Hey, the Mead House is produced for home mead makers and brewers looking for a bit of inspiration and information from the many guests and discussions we have here at the house. You can help support the Mead House by joining the Mead House Keyholder Club on Patreon. Just go to patreon.com and search for the Mead House. There's also a link in the show notes. For as little as $2 a month, you can become a keyholder. We've teamed up with some great companies to provide thank you gifts for your support. So get on over to Patreon, join the Mead House Keyholder Club, and get your own set of keys to the Mead House. You can listen to the Mead House podcast with your favorite player, and be sure to rate us 5 stars on iTunes or your favorite listening venue. The Mead House, mead making entertainment you just don't want to miss. Hey, welcome to the Mead House. You know, the nice thing about Yakima Chiefs hops is they are grower-owned. I think that pretty much ensures the high quality of their product because their livelihood depends on it. You know, being a former rancher, I can get aboard easily on that perspective. The beef I raised and the crops I ate were grown by me and fed my family. You should make Yakima Chief hops your source for your brews. After all, you made it. You need it to taste good. And it just might keep your relatives and friends happy that you did. Hey, thanks Yakima Chief for supporting the 2020 Mead House Iron V competition. Hey, Jeff and Ryan are both seated at the bar. I'm JD Webb. Hey, thanks for listening to episode 151. Hey, you know where it's at. iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on. Hey, check it out on the front page of the website, themeadhouse.com. Hey, in this episode, he's a passionate brewer from beer to mead, but he's also a former guest back on episode 121, and he's the hop professional from Yakima Chief Hops. Brian Pierce will be with us in just a little bit. Hey, in segment 2, we're going to try to transition from hops into something that kind of goes right along with it. You know, the one thing that sets off a good mead from, well, what might turn out to be something close to a hazmat experience is balance. Well, we'll talk about some ways to achieve that so that your relatives and neighbors try to keep them from calling 911. Hey, and we'll wrap the show with the Facebook friends. You know, we left off with a couple of them last week we want to get back to. So we've got all that to look forward to here tonight. Hey, all that and more. Thanks to all the Mead House key holders who help keep the Mead House podcast free. You, too, can become a Mead House key holder and help support the show for as little as $2 a month. We have some great thank you gifts we can send you. Get on over to patreon.com, search the Mead House, or just click the link in the show notes. And, you know, at some point, I just need to hire a monkey to read all that for me. Just push the button and let it roll. You know, I mean, what the heck? Hey, what are we drinking here tonight, guys? I've got something in, let's see, what is this? It's labeled spice stout bottle condition. I think this is one of Ryan's. Now on the top of the where I don't know where it went, but I think it said Xmas, like Christmas stout. I don't know what happened to the lid here. Let me see. Yeah, Ryan. I think this one's from you. Yeah, Xmas stout, Christmas stout. Taking a sip here. Wow. Right off the top, I get a ton of molasses. I'm not sure Yeah, I'm going to have to sip on this for a while. I get lots of molasses right up front, Ryan. It's nicely carved. Maybe a little overcarved for a stout. That's just my take on that. But what's in this? This is Probably several years old.
Yeah, it's a Christmas stout that a brew buddy and I put together a while back, and I I remember I think we had some cinnamon in there and some vanilla in there, and I'm trying to remember all the spices, but it was supposed to be a fairly, warming spice blend that would kind of remind you of, the smell of a house around Christmas baking time, I suppose. And again, I don't remember a ton about it. I think we did even have some really dark candy syrup in there, which is where you might be getting that molasses from, and maybe some dark fruit flavors as well. But yeah, when that warms up, why don't you chime back in and let us know what you are tasting, and I'd love to know what's coming across your palate.
There's there's some things floating around in it too. Is there something that you put in it? I don't know, maybe parts of a cinnamon stick or something. I'm not quite
Yeah,
sure.
you're calling out the floaties, huh?
Yeah.
Hey, no, the guy that I was brewing with, we fermented at his house, and he had some mishaps with his equipment, and the siphon didn't leave everything behind that
Gotcha.
was supposed. I think he got a little too close to the tube with the siphon, and some of that stuff made it into the brew bucket or the bottling bucket.
Yeah.
But it's not, no, that is absolutely an error.
All right, hey, no problem. You know, in my other fist, I'm drinking probably what's known as the oldest beverage on the planet. And depending upon where you go, like Alaska, I tell you, if you've ever had, if you've ever had it with the water from the glaciers, or even up to the Rocky Mountains, with the fresh, clean crispness of the water up there, or even if you get it from the store. My other drink is, well, water tonight. I have had a kind of an issue with my diabetes here lately, and the doctor says you need to cut back on the alcohol significantly. And I just asked him, well, what do you mean significantly? He says maybe a bottle of beer a week. I said, oh my God. So anyway, so I'm having to cut back royally. So that's in my other fish tonight, water. Jeff, you've always got something really good in your cup. What is it tonight?
So, in Mead House tradition, I am double fisting it tonight. In my first glass, I have my Belgian Golden Strong Braggot. It's nearly complete, or sorry, nearly drank up. And I made it for the cold part of the winter. We are getting out of that cold part of the winter, so timing it pretty well as far as this has lasted me, most of the way through the winter. I got a little bit left in the keg, and still very enjoyable. It's the hops are fading, sadly. I'm just not getting them the way I used to on this. Malt is still coming in really nice and strong. There's a good honey character to it, but it was honestly a lot better at the beginning of the winter, and I probably should have drank it a little faster. That's all right. It is still getting the job done. In my other glass, I have something a lot of bit odd compared to what I usually drink. I've talked to you guys before about how I moonlight at a local homebrew store, and one of our regulars brought me a bottle of a cordial that he made called Nocino. I don't know if you guys have ever even heard of this.
Nope.
But this is an Italian drink that's made with unripe walnuts.
Yeah, green walnuts.
Yeah, you harvest them, I guess, fairly early in the summer, and this is black. It is so black that I'm shining a flashlight from my phone through it, and I'm not getting much of anything apart from a little bit of brown at the edges. It is sweet, but there is a ton of tannin to it. It's got some spice character to it. It's got a definite kind of just a walnutty flavor, and it is tannic as all get out. After I tried this, I kind of said, I should try making a version of this without the sugar, just essentially those green walnuts and an alcohol base like vodka or grain alcohol, something like that, and use this as a kind of an oak substitute. Try that out because there is so much tannin in this. I think just like maybe a few milliliters of this in a gallon would make a quick and easy oak substitute. So that might be on the experimental drawing board soon.
That sounds new and different. Wow. Good stuff. Hey, Ryan, what's in your glass tonight?
I am drinking a version of the Ryan Braggot. This one is made with an orange product from Amaretti, and it's the orange. I think it's a bottle of the orange water. I think they call it, or orange water, orange blossom water, something like that. And it's very good. So this was the quick and easy extract version of it. I did 5-gallon batch, about 3 pounds of Pilsen extract. Boiled that for just to get to boiling, just to make sure everything was sanitized. I cooled it down, did a hop stand with Citra, all Citra hops, 5 ounces of Citra for about 30 minutes. Pulled that out and started and fermented it with, I believe it was Voss Kveik yeast. And then at high Kreuzen added 3 pounds of orange blossom honey. And then when the fermentation from that had also kind of subsided, I added the whole bottle of this orange water, orange blossom water from Amaretti, and then bottled it using a little more orange blossom honey as the priming sugar. And it's very good. It's got a lot of the citrus notes. It's light. It's refreshing. It's got some really nice orange flavor in it. And so I enjoy this one.
That sounds good.
Can I ask, how's the aroma on that? Are you getting a lot of orange?
I am. I'm getting a lot of orange, almost a little orange marmalade. But it's good. It's kind of a blend of like maybe some fresh oranges and then maybe some stewed oranges, or orange marmalade or something. So it's really good.
Wow.
Because the reason I ask, I have a wit braggot that I'm about to keg up once this keg is empty, and one of the cheats that I'm trying this year with my wit braggot is adding a bottle of orange water that I picked up from a Middle Eastern market, orange blossom water, and that I don't know how much it's going to add to the flavor, but I know from what I've seen, it adds a ton of aroma. So I was just curious how that was affecting what you're at.
Yep, and so I added it late, and I would recommend doing that. Adding it late in the process if it's clean, or sanitary. Just by bottling, even you could do it, or kegging.
That's my plan, to add it with a little bit of back sweetening, a little bit of orange blossom honey at the back sweetening phase, just to bring that orange up.
And I love Citra hops. That's probably one of my best go-to. I love the flavors that they impart. I dig Citra hops, so good choice.
Oh, yeah.
Great. Well, joining us tonight is Brian Pierce, Vice President at Yakima Chief Hops. Yakima Chief, of course, is a proud sponsor of the Iron Bee, the Braggot Challenge. All of our entrants are getting or will get some a selection of hops selected by the folks at Yakima Chief to inspire your braggot making. Brian is in charge of the hop selection program during the harvest. He's a passionate home brewer and mead maker. And welcome back to the show. I think you told us pre-show you just opened up a bottle of some dry hopped mead. Welcome back and tell us about that, Brian.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm excited to be back here, and following your fashion, I made sure I had two beverages for this. But one of them is definitely the dry hopped mead. I actually, this is my first tasting of it. I dry hopped it with fresh hops during harvest this year. So it actually had fresh 2019 Simcoes in it, from Save and Son. And, it's quite outstanding. It's, my first foray into just letting the wild yeast and the honey kind of take its path. So kind of have a lot of wild yeast here from the Yakima Valley with some, fresh hops from the Yakima Valley. And it's quite nice. It's nice and orange, has a little bit of pine character, some earth, and it has just a really slight tartness. And it's pretty low alcohol. I set this one up to be sort of on the lower spectrum, more of a sessionable mead. But I'm liking it quite a bit. I think it might actually, the rest of it I have might actually age out pretty well over time.
So are the wild yeast, was that from the hops?
No, when I blended everything together with my honey, I never did anything to boil it or kill it. So it's just whatever wild Brett or anything like that may have been suspended in the honey itself. The honey I use here actually is from it's a local beekeeper that sells honey in the summer at our farmers market in downtown Yakima. And it's pretty neat. I feel really remiss. I don't remember the name or his name that his brand is under off the top of my head. But he actually keeps beehives all around the Yakima Valley. And when he sells them, he just has this really nice label, and he just writes on Sharpie like what road it was off of. And it's kind of neat because there are roads that I'm very familiar with around all the hop fields in the lower valley. So the honey for this one specifically was from Longhouse Road. I don't know where on Longhouse Road it was, but that's kind of down by Toppenish. But yeah, so it's whatever was in there, probably a little residual from some of the fresh hops as well. And just kind of let it take its course.
Sounds great.
Very cool.
You said what's in your other hand?
In my other hand is something I don't often drink stylistically, but it's a Pilsner. It's actually Rogers Pilsner from Georgetown over in Seattle. And it's quite excellent. It's nice and crisp. It's got a little bit of a berry note to it, really clean. They're always making awesome beer. So it's a good, solid go-to. I had a good backup plan in case my mead wasn't that great right now.
You had full faith in yourself.
Yeah, I had a plan B, unfortunately.
Well, Brian, thanks for coming back on the show, and thank you to Yakima Chief for sponsoring the Braggot Shootout Challenge at the Iron Bee. Like we said, all of the contestants or participants are getting a selection of hops that were handpicked by your team that they thought would inspire folks to make some really interesting braggots or some great braggots. And we hope that they're doing that. I've been seeing some excitement online as packages have started to arrive and they get working on those. Now, we were trading emails earlier in the day, and just to refresh everyone's memory here, the Iron Bee, is a 2-category event, or every participant enters 2 meads, one of which is a braggot. Now, the BJCP states that a braggot is something along the lines of a harmonious blend of malt and honey, or beer and honey, or something along those lines. And that's true. And however, we are not judging the Braggot Challenge as against the BJCP guidelines. As is our tradition with the Iron Bee, the second category is judged hedonistically on drinking pleasure. So we open it up a little bit to people to try a few things that might get them knocked or not get them full points in a BJCP judge category. So what our participants need to do is craft a braggot that is great, that is designed for enjoyment, something that is great to enjoy. It doesn't have to necessarily fit any stylistic category of beer. So it just has to have characteristics that we can identify it as having beer and honey, or characteristically representing both beer and honey or beer and mead, and really that's it. So starting from that point, if you said, okay, I need to make a braggot here or a mead, and I'm going to try to make it really enjoyable to drink, how would we start thinking about hops? Now, I'll tell you, Brian, what I started thinking about, we started talking about this segment, and if I was participating or thinking in your chair, I might try to think, or what are the sexy beer styles right now? And is there anything that can be done around that? Would that also lend itself to an inspiration on a braggot? Now, I'm in Minneapolis, and I saw there's some news lately because our legislature's in session, and they're trying to fix some laws to make things hopefully a little bit easier for some of the brewers around, commercial brewers around here, the microbrewers. And there was something like 160 breweries in Minnesota. And I live in an area that's got quite a few of them. And I can't go into a brewery without getting one of these hazy, hop forward, low bitterness, fruity, juicy ales, on usually about half the menu. I kind of think that's the trendiest beer style that I can think of right now. And I don't know and I think maybe, there could be something you could do around that with a braggot. That just popped me. In the few hours that you had to think about this, what crossed your mind?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I guess, I would say I agree that continues to be the very strong trend in U.S. craft beer is, your very hazy New England style IPA. So yeah, thinking of that in light of braggot is actually interesting. That's a little bit where my mind drifted is, it's sort of looking at what's new in the world today, what's everyone excited about, what are those flavors, those aromas. And then actually I kind of reflect a little bit on how old braggot really is and a lot of the history of braggot. And so I actually think it's kind of an intriguing idea to bring those two worlds together because, looking at where beer is today in the world, it's sort of kind of a neat opportunity to tie in braggot along with some of those trends. So, yeah, that's a lot of where my mind went. It's interesting when I would think of designing a New England IPA, I'd be thinking a lot about stable haze, a lot about lots of oil retention in my beer, doing a lot of low temperature additions of hops, whirlpool additions, really late additions in a boil. And so I actually think that lends really well to crossing that line of beer and mead into braggot. I think of, if I was going to make a base wort to sort of then combine with honey and have that sort of BJCP guideline of the pleasant marriage of those two things together. I'd really be thinking about, well, what's the backbone of a New England IPA and what makes it hazy from that very beginning. And so really, for me, it's trying to find a lot of adjuncts and things like that are going to have that higher protein content that are going to linger, finding yeast strains that tend to help with that. And also trying to find yeast strains that really play in that space of biotransformation when I think of interacting with hops and hop oils, which is, tends to be a really big part of utilizing hops in that style of beer. So something that could translate really well into a braggot. So, for me, if I were to think of blending some of the things I like to make at home with mead and with New England IPA as well, is putting lots of things like oats, wheat, things like that are going to have some of that more stable haze character, and utilizing that as some of the backbone or some of the malt that I want to bring into my braggot. And then if I were to look at tying in hops, looking at some of the really classic braggot styles, you'd think a lot of European noble hops, right? A lot of like earthy, floral, some spice character, things that you'd often get for maybe UK hops, maybe some really lineage hops from like Czech Sots or something like that. But bringing that into that newer world, I think, well, yeah, what is Citra, like you mentioned, bringing to the table when it comes to that nice like orange character, grapefruit, kind of a real zestiness. Even Simcoe, like I was mentioning earlier, having some of that like nice bright orange and some pininess to it. Mosaic with some of the really nice fruity notes. And so I would think about what honeys would go well with that. And really those styles lend well to late additions of hops, which is right where I'd want to be putting a lot of the flavor and aroma of my honey to make sure it really carries through into my finished braggot. So that's kind of immediately how I would start looking at that and piecing it together. And then I guess the other piece of that for me, or something I've always really conscious of mead versus beer so much, but I think still applies to braggot quite a bit, is really managing yeast health and yeast selection. So no, I know not really on the topic of hops, but when you're bringing in hops, you want to really be thinking of what yeast play well in biotransformation. And so you mentioned a little bit ago about Voss Kveik, and that's a variety that does really well. It has a lot of biotransformative characters where it's bringing in flavors from the oils of the hops and actually turning them into something different than where they may have started. When I look at some really classic mead yeast strains or even wine yeast strains or champagne yeast strains that people tend to bring in for some meads, they may not actually play as well into that braggot space. Just because they're not going to necessarily have that lineage of being in that environment and really being selected for those kinds of attributes. Looking at more of that fruit side of things where they're transforming more basic sugars just into alcohol. So those are a lot of things I'd think about just from a very, very high level as I'd start thinking, what do I want this to taste like? What's the end result of this going to look like?
What I really love about this category, this braggot category, is the variety that you can get. You can do something from, say, a New England style IPA braggot to a brut IPA braggot, and then on the other side, I've also, some of the breweries around here do things like honey porters or honey stouts and things like that, which draw out more of the honey sweetness, and I think about that as well. Before we kind of move on, because I've got a question for you when you talk about the late edition, but before we move on, how would you think about hopping a sweeter style to give it balance? So I'm thinking here of, like, if you were going with like a sweet stout, but you might be going even a little sweeter because you're trying to bring in some honey flavor, but you can't let it drift into chocolate milk or cloyingly sweet. How do you think about a hop that plays well in that style?
Yeah, I think really any hop's going to offset against something like that well, as long as it's what you're going for. But what I would say, and this is very true of just general hop usage in beer, is you want some of that bitterness to offset some of that. So, right, when you think of like a New England style IPA, something that has really, really low bitterness, trying to achieve as low as possible for the most part. Not every brewer is doing that. And what you're picking up is just a little bit of that perceived bitterness of some of the isomerized alpha acids that exist in the hops that maybe even weren't really converted because of how late the additions were made and how low the temperatures were. But if I were to make something more like a sweeter stout or something like that, or sort of version of a braggot or something that's going to have a little more of that residual sweetness, maybe heavier body, I'd really be looking at pushing my additions up a little sooner in the boil portion of making this, just so that you're bringing in some of that bitterness or adding a little bit of IBUs, just so you can offset some of that sweetness. Because that's really a really strong function, is that balance of sweetness and bitterness. And so trying to really, if you're going to have a really mild sweetness, then I'd be looking at maybe shooting for BUs of 20 to 30, which, for that style, like a stout wouldn't be too abnormal. And going from there, if you want it even sweeter, then I would say I would up that even more, and maybe shooting for 30 to 40, and kind of doing your isomerization calculations like you would for a beer. The only thing I would caution, though, is you would have to consider that if you're doing it in a braggot, and you're doing it in a boil, that you're not done adding a lot of your sugars during the boil, because you're going to want to put your honey late in. And so you would have to kind of offset the dilution of putting honey in later versus having it all present, because it will change the efficiency of the isomerization of your alpha acids.
How would you make the adjustment then?
I would really base it on a ratio by weight. So I'd be looking at, what's the gravity that I'm boiling in, and then what's my gravity going to be after I blend in, and what are those kind of ratios between the two of them, and just offsetting it so that if you're going to shoot for 20 or 30, but you're going to dilute it by X amount of specific gravity, then you'd want to kind of calculate what that would look like in that gravity as well. Just so you're not planning on it being one thing and then you blend later and realize that you didn't come back and try to do the math on it again.
Yeah, gotcha.
Yeah.
So Brian, I wanted to come back. You're talking about some late additions, and what I had mentioned in this braggot that I'm currently drinking, I did a hop stand. So after the boil was finished, I turned the flame off, put the hops in a hop sock, and dropped it in the kettle and let it kind of hang out for a little while. And I've done that at maintaining temperatures and not quite strictly as maintaining temperatures, maybe letting it free fall over 30 minutes, which might only be a few degrees or something like that. But there has been some talk, I don't want to say debate, because I think it depends on what you're going for, but at doing these hop stands at, say, 190 degrees or 180 degrees or 170 or 160, can you talk to us a little bit about what's happening at the different temperatures when during a hop stand?
Yeah, definitely. So lower temperatures in general, what you're trying to achieve is going to be less volatilization of your oils. So, realistically, for every 10 degrees that you're dropping, you're going to cut a reaction time in half or cut the volatilization down significantly. And so, if you're putting a bunch of hops in at 180 at like boiling versus 180, or even down to 160, you're going to significantly reduce the amount of those oils that you're losing just in the heat and in the evaporation out of what you're during your stand. So what brewers are really trying to achieve, or even sometimes when I'm doing my hopped meads, what I'm really trying to achieve is the lowest temperature I feel comfortable at. I generally, for myself, would say I feel confident at 180, particularly because 180 is the temperature that will really kill anything besides thermophiles. So when I'm looking at putting in hops, which are a raw agricultural product, if you put your temperature too low, you're not necessarily killing any residual bacteria or anything like that. So you do have some slight risk of infection. But depending on what you're making, generally speaking, your commercial pitch of yeast that you buy or that you're going to put in is going to outcompete anything, and really probably you won't see it. So I can just say, craft breweries across the U.S. Doing this kind of thing, 180 can be pretty common, especially if you're really trying to capture a very hop forward flavor and aroma. But I've seen down to 160 myself as well. It's not something I've played around with personally, but I do think if you can introduce at, let's say, 180, really you can leave it hang out for a while, but you're still going to have isomerization of your alpha acids above 140 degrees Fahrenheit. And so if you're leaving it sit in there for 30 minutes, you are going to create some of that bitterness from the hop character. So I know for myself, a lot of times I'll introduce hops at 180, but I'll try to actually cool very rapidly from there. And so I can say, not this one I just opened, but a one I made prior. I actually introduced hops at 180 and then dropped my temperature down to actually pitching temperature in about 15 minutes. Just really trying to cool quickly so that I could really, it has that initial shock of killing anything on it at that temperature, but then really making sure that I retain as much oil as possible. Just because that's really what's going to carry a lot of that flavor through into your finished braggot.
So, okay, so you introduced the hops at 180. You dropped it down to pitching temperature. At pitching temperature, I don't know what kind of yeast you're using. What say in 60s or 70s? Where was your pitching temperature?
I'm usually shooting for right about 70 degrees for myself. For most of my meads, I'll just say I use a lot of it's Lavlin's. Man, I always get this wrong. It's 1116. I think it's their Sauvignon Blanc white wine strain.
Yeah.
It's kind of a favorite of mine.
Yeah, get one V.
Yep. Yeah. That's it. I always forget. There's like one extra one in there. I can't remember how many ones there are. But yeah, that's a really good go-to for myself. I tend to see that it actually has some of that biotransformation character to it, where it'll actually bring out some flavors in the hops that you're not necessarily seeing up front. But to answer your question, yeah, that's kind of my reference. I've played around with some other ones like WLP 99, which I know is the mead strain for White Labs as well.
Sure. So sure. What I was asking though was saying, so in 15 minutes of going from 180 to 70, are you done then? At 15 minutes, do you take the hops out, or do you continue to let them hang out at 70 degrees? And if so, what's that doing for you?
No, that's a good question. Yeah, after that 15 minutes, I'm removing all my wort or all my liquids from my hops. I really don't want them in there anymore. What I'm really trying to accomplish with that is a really quick, rapid extraction of all the oil I possibly can. But I really want to separate my hop material as soon as I can, because I don't want any of the really the tannic or polyphenol or stringent characters of any of the green plant matter really.
Okay. Now, one last question on braggots, and then we got to move on. Unless Jeff or JD want to jump in, but when I do my all grain braggots, and again trying to really get that hop flavor, I started this last year was mash hopping, or putting some of the hops right in with the grains when I'm mashing. And I've had what I feel are pretty good results with that, as not as the only hop addition, but as a hop addition. Help us understand a little bit of what's going on there with the oils, the transformation, and the bonding and things like that when you mash hop, and I guess if you recommend it.
Yeah, so mash hopping is actually there's a couple different sides to or opinions to mash hopping, and that's something I've actually played around with a little bit myself. One benefit I really enjoy of mash hopping is hops do have some enzymatic activity, and so they can help a little bit with your conversion rate sometimes. So you can slightly get a little more efficiency sometimes out of your mash. That's actually something that at Yakima Chief we've been doing a lot of studies on, just because we have some products like our American Noble products. They're actually a high concentration of some of that enzymatic or material itself. So that is something that's happening there. And then really when you're bringing that over and boiling from there, you have, and I almost look at it as sort of you are going to add some bitterness just because you're bringing over any residual alpha acids and stuff like that that's gone into solution. So that's kind of some of the upfront stuff. There's some other opinions out there on that of whether the efficiency is really worth some of the loss that you might get in just liquids. I generally don't dose that high in mash hopping. So I mean, there's some differences in opinions there as well.
What I've found when I'm doing some of my hoppier braggots or beers is that I find mash hopping helps retain the hoppiness a little longer, I should say. If I were to do a side by side, two different, say, IPAs, and one was mash hop and one wasn't, even though they had the same amount of hops in them. The one that was mash hop seems to stay, I'm using air quotes here, but fresher or hoppier longer. Is that something that you guys have found, or is there anything behind that, or is that just, do you think that's just kind of one of those placebo effects?
Yeah, I don't know if there's anything that would necessarily keep. I guess I would ask, what, when you're saying hoppier, is it more of just in the flavor component, a bitterness component, or do you actually feel like it helps carry on an aroma, like a longer,
Yeah,
I guess, quote
the
unquote,
way to say it
shelf
is,
life?
if you've had, pull a, an IPA off the shelf that's maybe been there for 4 months, and it's not as bitter. It doesn't have that aroma. It doesn't pop like one that was kegged yesterday. And I feel like the mash hopping, it's not a light switch. I mean, a 6-month-old IPA is a 6-month-old IPA, but it retains the bitterness a little better. It retains the aroma a little better. And again, I haven't done a full, Brewlosophy style, test on this, but just anecdotally, I find that is another benefit of the mash hopping that I've done.
Interesting. Yeah, that's not something I've seen or have actually heard much about. I would say, just thinking about what hop compounds are in use there in different parts of what you're doing. Bringing in hops in your mash right into a boil is you're going to have a lot more isomerization, which is a much more stable form of alpha acid. So bitterness tends to linger and tends to stay in beer a much longer period of time. So, putting it there versus doing it all late addition, where a lot of what you're retaining in your oils and in your alpha acids is unisomerized, they're less stable in that state. And so that's where you see, even in some degree, New England IPAs not being very shelf stable. And a lot of that has to do with haze, but it also has to do with the amount of character that's really crammed in there. But yeah, I don't know if I've ever seen or heard any correlation between those things. Another place my mind goes to a little bit is that enzymatic activity that when you're doing a lot of late addition hopping, you are putting those enzymes in late, and so you will continue to get some conversion of sugars actually into alcohol from that, from the hopping itself. And so if you're doing stuff earlier like that in your mash, you're doing that up front, which means you're going to have less change over time in like a bottle or in your keg. Or if you did a lot of late addition or even dry hopping especially, that's where you're introducing some more of that enzymatic activity, which could actually drop or increase your alcohol level a little bit. It can change some of the character that you're experiencing. And it's what's really known a lot in the brewing industry is hop creep. So I think what you're doing, I would honestly, we'd have to probably do some experiments to really see if I've never heard of seeing it that way, but that's just kind of where my mind goes a little bit when you say that.
Well, we'll have you guys do that. We'll have the Yakima Chief Labs do some side-by-side research, and the next time you come on, you can tell us about it.
Yeah, there we go. Now you're giving me ideas. I'll have to do this at home.
All right.
Something. Hang on, Ryan. Something. I wanted to. I was going to try to get Brian to get back into, pairing hops. I don't. For sake of time, we may save that for another visit with Brian. But I want to tell our listeners this: if you go back to 121, and I may even cut that piece out. That segment that we did with Brian, he talks about pairing hops. It might be something useful to our competitors who are working on their braggots for the Iron B. I highly encourage, in fact, I may even cut that whole episode out and put it up as a special segment up on the website, or even, get it over on iTunes. It's really a worthwhile segment with Brian. He really goes into quite a bit, but specifically the pairing of hops, which I found quite interesting and very useful. So with that, continue on. Thanks.
Yeah, well, so that's great. Excellent that we talked about beers and braggots, and I kind of want to flip us over here to their side. Hops are used in a lot more than than just beers and braggots. Last year, one of the more celebrated mead makers, Adam Bystrom, who's been on our show a couple of times, made a hopped grapefruit mead, or a dry hop grapefruit mead that was very celebrated and won a lot of awards. Did excellent. I said, I go to the supermarket now and I see dry hop kombucha. There's a couple of cideries not far from here, and one of them does, a dry hop cider. Hop cheese is all over the place. I want to talk about now, and it's perfect for what you're drinking, but in using hops, sans grains, we'll call that. And what do you think about when you're doing hop selection and dry hopping or wet hopping or however else you want to add your hops into a mead? So I think, well, you didn't exactly tell us how you did what the one you put together here, but maybe we can start there. But then, as JD was saying, I think a good thing to think was, how do you think about hop selection and utilization when you're going about putting together, say a traditional mead, or just honey, or versus maybe some fruits or some other spices or some things like that?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I guess for myself, I'll start a little bit with this one I have, because I think it's not. I guess it's a good example of how I probably wouldn't normally approach doing this. It was really sort of an idea of what can I do with fresh hops. So let's play around with some more wild yeast in the honey. But I will say wild yeast generally tend to kill a lot of hop character, and so that's something I would be very cautious of if you're going that route. Is that they tend to munch away for a long time. They tend to interact with hops very differently than a lot of your more commercial strains or domesticated strains of yeast. But yeah, when I'm thinking of, I guess I would actually go back a little bit, maybe to what I mentioned earlier of really at the beginning, if I were to take grain out of the picture, the sans grain idea, then I'd be looking at how sweet is my mead going to be, is sort of a starting place. And so, I mentioned the one I'm drinking right now, I really shot for a very low sort of sessionable, sort of a very approachable kind of mead. But with that is going to come, depending on your yeast strain, and how much honey you're putting in. Do you want it to end up dry, or do you want it to have some residual sweetness? Like I said, the more sweetness you're going to have, or that you're planning on having, you're going to want if you want hop character to be in there, you're going to want to offset it a little bit with bitterness. So if you plan on it being very sweet, really having a lot of that character almost cloying, then I would say if you're including hops, you're going to want to add a lot more of the bitterness side. So putting it in a place where you can be isomerized. So I would even look at maybe boiling some of my honey or some of my hops in honey to get some of that alpha acid to turn into your iso alpha acid for bitterness. If you're looking for the flavor components, hops are always going to have a little bit of plant character to them. So when I think of mead in general, has a lot of history with using different spices and herbs and things like that, is I'd really be looking at what else is going to go in this. So like you mentioned grapefruit for the one that you were just talking about. I would look at that and say, well, what hops go well with grapefruit? What have grapefruit character? What else would I want to eat with grapefruit at some point? Or what else would I want to drink if I was to have grapefruit extract or the actual fruit itself? What pairs well? And I think, maybe a good example is a couple of years ago now, I have this plum mead I really like to make. And I often find it has this nice, almost sort of elderflower sort of, I always say that character kind of is like a rubber balloon a little bit, but I like it a lot. But it has a little bit of that character that I think comes from the plums. It comes from the honey. But what I found is that I really think tropical character and then some floral accentuation really goes nicely with that. And so I've played around with hops like Equinut that have a really strong tropical character, the really resinous hop. And then something like Laurel that has a really nice sort of floral note, sort of harken back to noble hops a little bit, but with a little more American twist, I would say, on it, with some lemon and lemongrass notes. But so just finding, those subtle nuances that you can bring in instead of having that one-dimensional maybe plum character that's being brought across. Is now you have this a pairing of things that are coming together, and are really sort of bringing it out in a different way, and then just balancing that bitterness to how much sweetness I expected to be in there to sort of find that nice harmony between all of those things.
Excellent. One more before I relinquish the microphone here. JD is quite the chef in his house. How can he integrate hops into his kitchen?
Oh man, so this is something I play around with a little bit myself because I like cooking quite a bit. So hops are interesting because I don't know if you've ever tried to eat a hop, but they don't taste that great on their own.
No, they don't. I've done that. Yeah, no, they don't. Not something you want to chew on.
No, but what I will say, something I've played around with is, if you were to ever taste a hop, and I don't recommend anyone do this unless you want to, but a lot of what they smell like is going to translate well into beer, but sometimes can change. It can translate well into mead, but sometimes it can change. And a lot of that has to do with that biotransformation and that interaction with yeast, and how those compounds change during that fermentation. So for myself, where I've sort of delved in the cooking world a little bit of it is, what else could I be making from a food product that has that sort of biotransformation yeast interaction? So I think of, fermented foods, like lacto fermented foods. That's on my list of things to do. I haven't done that myself, but when I have,
so I could make a Simcoe sauerkraut.
Yeah, I would encourage people to try it. I'm not going to guarantee it's good.
That sounds interesting. Yeah.
But I think where you have that transformation is where you're going to bring unique characters from the hops into that flavor profile. One I've played around with a little bit actually is sourdough bread making, putting really, really, really small amounts of hops into bread dough, and not right about when you're going to bake it, actually early on, so that it's having that time with yeast, and then baking it from there. And so I've played around with that with cryo hops and with American Noble and things like that, with just some T90s. And really, really low dosages, it can bring something interesting depending on the hop. I think of, if you want some of that more herbal character that people like in their bread.
Okay, thanks to Ryan. He just opened up the door. I mean, Ryan knows that I've got a sourdough culture that I've had for, probably 18 years or so. I mean, it's like having a 2-year-old in the house. You keep feeding the damn thing, and Ryan knows it. Ryan knows that I like to bake bread, especially sourdough bread. Okay, so how do you introduce hops into sourdough bread? And this is like way off. This is like way off the target here from Mead House, but how do you introduce hops into sourdough bread?
Yeah, no, it's don't worry, it's way off target for Yakima Chief hops too. But I would say since we're on this topic, I have found I take really small amounts of pellets, and I'll actually crush them up and mix them in, and then really give it a day or two of that fermentation time.
Yeah.
I have tried it right as I'm going to bake, right? So I'll add them in, kind of mix it in, form my dough, and get it into an oven. And when you do that, it's gonna taste like eating hot pellets because it hasn't had that transformation time.
Yeah.
So getting really, really small amounts integrated can do something interesting. I've done it with just like normal yeast strains too. This is not something I see around a lot. I know some restaurants have played around with different things and integrating hops into sausage and things like that. But so far, I think a lot of it has really translated well into the beverage industry, like you mentioned, kombucha, ciders, teas, things like that.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to it now. Now you got me started. I got sourdough recipes running through my brain now. So excellent. And when I do I usually have a 24-hour, and when I do my breads, I put I make a sponge first. Now, I mean, that sponge, you can let that sponge ride for 24 hours, 32 hours if you want it. So maybe that would be the appropriate time to drop the ground up hop pellets in, and just let it ferment for a couple of days, and then start adding your water and your flour and do it that way. So that's something I am definitely going to try. Absolutely.
Well, let me know how that goes for you, because I'm still playing around with it myself.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, man. Wow, never thought of that. Thanks, Ryan.
Yeah, you're welcome. Jeff, anything burning in your mind?
Yeah, I want to circle back to something Brian mentioned before about getting bitterness into a mead. So the idea of boiling honey is kind of a taboo subject in a lot of circles in the mead making world here these days. Just because there is this tendency to drive off a lot of the aromas and things like that. But you mentioned needing to isomerize some of those oils into bittering compounds when it comes to getting that bitterness. But I know from my research, and my research may be limited, maybe a little bit flawed, that isomerization tends to happen a lot better when there's sugar at play. Can you talk a little bit more about that, and like how much sugar we would need to have in there, and in this case, like honey, to really get those bittering compounds rock and rolling?
Sure. Yeah. I guess, a general rule of thumb is just, when you think of sugars, I guess generally it's just the gravity of what you're boiling is going to have an effect on how well you get that conversion. And a lot of that has to just do with the heat transferring. And if you have something really thick, it's going to change how that interacts. So I would say, and even for myself, I tend to not boil in honey because I don't want to have that, loss of my aroma and flavor that's captured in the honey. So there's a couple different ways I would look at that. One is, you could look at boiling a portion of what you're intending to use and then actually, adding in honey after you've let it cool so that you have that isomerization going, but you're going to introduce it into your entire batch. So that's one way I'd look at it. The other way I do it is I've been making a lot of session meads. So lower alcohol, not your classic, mead with a higher alcohol and thicker. And,
Sure.
So in that production, I'm often introducing a lot of water, right, and more water, and so that's another way you could do it too. Is just really boiling it in water. You don't necessarily need the sugar; it's much more dependent on temperature, and so that's where you would just kind of want to basically calculate, and I know there's all sorts of online calculators you could sit down and write it longhand if you wanted to, but really what I would look at is what's the gravity of my water, which is going to be almost nothing, right? But you could do your calculation on that. And then that's where I guess I would go down the path of probably introducing a little bit of honey just so that you have something there that you're boiling besides water. And then bringing those two elements together, your boiled now sanitized water that has hops in it, that has some isomerized alpha acid in it, mixing that back in with your honey so that you get it. I definitely would not recommend taking your full batch of honey and water mixed together and boiling the whole thing because you're right. I think you would lose a lot of what you want out of your honey.
Shade, top me.
What's that? Sorry.
Say it again,
Ryan.
Ryan.
I was being facetious or possibly giving our listeners ideas in saying if you were going to boil it with the hops, you could create a Bochet hopped mead.
Oh, yeah.
Or a hopped Bochet.
Very good.
Well, Brian, thank you. We have kept you longer than we intended, and we thank you for being so generous with your time. I know I'm going to go back and listen to this segment again, and I think a lot of people are. You are always so knowledgeable and so helpful, and we look forward to having you back again soon.
Absolutely. It's been my pleasure. I really appreciate it. And there's nothing I enjoy more than getting to talk about mead since I'm often talking about beer. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to next time.
Thank you, Brian. Absolutely. Wow. I tell you, what a segment. That ran a little bit long, but, once again, for our listeners, go back to 121, episode 121, iTunes, Stitcher, whatever you want. It's even on the on the website. Listen to the interview that we did with Brian first time around, and seriously, I think I'm gonna go back to that episode, maybe cut out that piece that he did with the pairing and everything, or maybe even just cut out that whole interview and put it up as a special as a special segment, put it up on the post and get up on iTunes, just so people can listen to it. Maybe even put it up on Patreon as well.
Yeah, so keep a lookout for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just wealth of knowledge between these two interviews.
Oh, God, yeah. He's helped me, in my brewing. I mean, like I said, that first episode, he went into that hop pairing thing, putting a couple of different, kinds of hops together, one at the boil, one for aroma, two different hops. I mean, it's a wealth of information. So, but hey, yeah, let's get on into segment two here. Is there anything as far as the Iron B 2020 update? Anything new?
Yeah, I just want to hit two things. Again, registration is open. The first packs have gone out. People who are registered, so those have hit mailboxes and are hitting mailboxes soon, and people are getting started on those. There is still plenty of time to register. We're over halfway full, but we do have more. If this episode inspired you, or if you want to jump in, please sign up, and Jeff will get out a package to you in the mail, again, including those hops that were specifically selected for meads and braggots, from the experts at Yakima Chief. And then lastly, and here's the second thing I wanted to hit, was last week, I think it was last week, I mentioned kind of the bragging rights challenge, and I said that this is a really fun competition to do with your homebrew club, whether that was a formal club or an informal club or an in-person community or online community, whatever it was. And two groups so far have told us that they're participating. So the Minnesota Homebrewers Association is taking part in the bragging rights challenge, and so is they're calling themselves Hive Mind. This is the Reddit mead community. So if you're a Reddit user, the r/mead, or the mead on Reddit community, and they're using the name Hive Mind, I believe. So two groups are already doing that. If you are a member of either of those groups, you're going to want to get in on this. So if you participate on Reddit, make sure that you sign up for the competition, and you can be a part of that other tertiary competition there. If you're a member of the Minnesota Homebrewers Association, make sure you get in on this too. I think there's quite a few of those guys who are already jeering each other and getting ready for this fun competition. So do that. And don't let your club get left out. Make sure that you've got at least five of the home brewers, and do that. I'd love to see some more online communities. I'd love to see some more neighborhood, association communities get involved. So please do that, and then just shoot us a Facebook message or an email, even better, and let us know you want to participate in it, because we will give the clubs kind of the breakdown of scores so that they can jeer each other a little bit more, and a special prize to the winner of each club that participates in the Bragging Rights Challenge. So make sure that you get your members sign up. Jeff will do his best to get out the ingredients as quickly as possible, and you guys can have an extra fun club competition. And that is our update this week with the Iron B.
Very good. Very good. Kind of a segue from the hop discussion we had with Brian. Wanted to move into it's going to have to be probably a brief discussion on this next subject, but I wanted to talk a little bit about some ways to achieve balance. That may be, I don't know if it's the most difficult thing to do when you're making mead. I've had difficulties with it in the past, and just knowing what ingredients that you're working with, and what are the things that we can do, some ways to achieve a nice balance. But let's say we're working on a hopped mead. Okay, how do you achieve that right balance between what may be the bitterness and flavors of the hops versus, the honey that you've used or whatever adjuncts that you might have used. Jeff, throw it over to you. I know you've played around with a lot of different things, and you're the kind of
Sure.
the house experimenter, so the house scientist.
Well, and I think I can speak to this to some degree as a BJCP meat judge as well. You mentioned a kind of a balance between flavor and aroma when we were talking about this earlier today. The first thing that came to mind is that I had a mead that I judged a while back that when I went and took a sniff of it, and I got that first scent of aroma. I got a really heavy honey character. It was really strong. I was getting like a lot of floral notes off of it, and there were some other characters from the other stuff that went into the mead, of course. I think it was like a melomel or something like that. I went to taste it. The mead was very dry, and I was struggling to find that honey character. So I think when we're talking about balance, the main thing you really want to focus on is how is the various components playing well together. Because when I smelled all that honey aroma, I expected something semi-sweet to sweet, and I got something very dry, and it was kind of jarring. Frankly, you kind of went, "Oh, this is not what I expected. This is not what I wanted to taste." Even though you guys that have listened to the show know I tend to prefer dry meats.
Yeah.
I was all that honey character was making me anticipate something sweet, and I went, "Huh, what?" And I had that moment of cognitive dissonance, which is just not what you want. You kind of want everything to play nice together and kind of go, okay, well, if you've got a lot of honey character in the smell, you want a lot of honey character in the taste. And I've talked before about the idea of balancing, your sweetness and your acidity and your tannin and things like that. And they don't necessarily have to all be on the same level, but everything's got to play nice together. You kind of think of like a symphony. Not everybody's playing the same notes, but it all sounds good together.
Yeah. Yeah, Ryan. How do you achieve that balance? What? How do you get to that place?
It is one of the ever debated, most debated topics on mead is balance. What does it mean? How do you get it? How do you know when you've done it to perfection? I'm still a student of balance, to be quite honest. I know that I've made meads that are too tart. I've made meads that don't have enough acidity. I've made meads that are on the sweeter end. I don't think I've ever made a mead that's quite too dry, but it's like, can put sand in a glass and be happy. But, put it this way. I typically know because I miss, and I can think of about 3 meads that I've made in the last, or that I've had. Some of them are years old, but I can think of 3 meads that I've had in the last few months where I've missed. I made a Pyment that needed more acidity. It needed acidity to bring it balanced. I had another one that was just too tart. And I once it was cut, when I did a blend with it, it was fine. It was delicious. But I'm still on that side of it, of saying sometimes I know when I haven't done it. Now, if you want to hone in on one thing, let's hone in on say kind of the aroma, where you were and where Jeff was. Late additions are kind of my key to aroma, whether I'm making a braggot or a melomel or even maybe a fruit and spice mead, is really adding as much as I can as late as I can, which tends to retain that aroma, and that's where I go most of the time. JD, this was your topic, and I think that you might have some ideas or opinions on it or ponder it.
That's why I'm asking the questions. I mean, to me, it's all about taste. I've made some stuff in the past that have went right down the sewer line, and then I've made some stuff that immediately went into a keg, and it's been delicious, and we drank the whole damn thing. And when I start thinking about it, I mean, it all came down to balance. I mean, it's all about what tasted good. And I was thinking about raspberries today because I love raspberries, but it's not a fruit that you just pop in your mouth and chew on like a blackberry. You know what I mean? It's a butt puckering tart little fruit. And so how do you?
I might disagree with you there, but yeah,
well,
go ahead.
I mean, raspberries do have a limited amount of sweetness. I'll give you that. But they're, when you take of all the berries out there, raspberries are probably the most tart. At least that's been my experience. But so I love raspberries though, and I wanted to play around with a raspberry braggot. So I'm thinking, okay, like the three of us here, we all enjoy the drier side of things when it comes to our own brews. Now, how do you achieve that balance with raspberries in a 4 or 5% braggot? Is not going to be sweet, and maybe introduce some hops into it. I mean, I'm going through some hop ideas here to try to pair with the raspberries. But achieving that balance where the tartness of the raspberries is not so prominent, and gives way to the other flavors that may be incorporated, like hops. How to get there. And I mean, for me, it's all about taste. But once you get it in the fermenter, I don't want to say it's a done deal, because if it doesn't come out right in secondary, you can always, Ryan is famous for blending. You could always do something else. So how do you get to that point? That's my dilemma.
Well, and
Go ahead, Jeff.
Well, I was going to say that this kind of does circle back to what Ryan was saying about late additions, and we can talk additionally. This is probably like an entire segment all by itself, but just the little tweaks you do between calling it basically done and bottling. You can do a little bit of if your meat is feeling a little bit flabby, you can brighten it up with some acid. You can add a little bit more oak. You can add a little bit more fruit. In this case, I would start really small with the raspberry, and then if it needed a little bit more raspberry, you could try adding some amaretti or some fruit compound or something like that. A little closer to bottling, and punch that up a little bit. You trying to find a hop that goes well with it. This is just because you're done fermenting doesn't mean your meat is done. There is a lot you can do kind of in that final tweaking phase to just get it the rest of the way there. But to some extent, this is a learning process for all of us. We're all kind of figuring it out, and you need a little bit of experience, I think, to know, okay, well, 2 pounds of raspberries is a little too much. Let's start with 4 ounces and go from there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, just like you talked about late additions, right? We both talked about adding, orange blossom water, essentially at bottling,
Right.
Now, there are people today that started mead making as their entry into beverage making. But and there probably always have been, of course. But if you go back even just a handful of years, you would find people typically came at it from one of two directions. They either came at it from the beer side or the wine side. And one of the dichotomies that I used to see was that people who came at it from the beer side would say, okay, fermentation's over, we're done. And the people who came at it from the wine side said, okay, fermentation's over. Time to get started. And because they're used to doing a little more post-fermentation, tweaking, additions, that kind of thing. And now I think that, there is this blending of worlds a little bit, or at least that people are saying, mead, you come at mead its own way, or you can do different things. So, I think that, I've infamously said a few times that, no mead's ever finished until you're happy with it. And if that includes a lot of blending, it includes a lot of blending. But I think you can do that. The last thing I wanted to say on this topic, at least for now, was carbonation. You mentioned, when you were talking about trying a mead that had great aroma, but was rye or something. So last night, I poured a bottle of mead for a friend that was over, highly carbonated. If you guys haven't noticed, that's my trend. Apparently, I've even over carbonated stout.
Yeah. This one at least.
Yeah. So it was a dark berry hydromel. So I mentioned, I think last week, I don't make a lot of dark berry mead. So I make some. A lot doesn't mean none. And it was like black currants and raspberries and tart cherries. And it was session mead. It was tart. It was dry. And it was highly carbonated. I done with hops too. And that carbonate, it just forces the aroma out of the glass into your nose. So my buddy was getting all of this aroma. Like he was I get honey on the aroma. I get honey on the or berries on the aroma. And then he was drinking it, and he was saying, if I didn't know any better, like if I had a plugged nose or pinched my nose, I wouldn't get any of that, because this is a dry mead, and it just doesn't have the complexity of flavors that I'm getting from this, just effervescence, shooting these aromas, up my nostrils. And so carbonation is another weapon that you've got in your quiver, or a bullet in your chamber. When you're doing that, I mean, that was the whole thing behind the Brut IPA craze that lasted about 12 minutes.
Yeah.
But it was just about, forcing this aroma upward, and that definitely, there is something to be said for that, and that it can be done. JD, now that you've been drinking that stout, hopefully it's come up in temperature a few degrees.
It has.
What are you tasting now?
Yeah, I'm getting a few of the classic Christmas spices like allspice, clove. Still a very prominent molasses, which is a holiday. I mean, a lot of people make. My grandmother, my God, she used to make these molasses cookies in the holiday period, Christmas time. Oh my God, really good. But I'm getting, and then there's the bitterness. I don't know that the bitterness is actually coming from the hops as much coming from the molasses flavor that I'm getting. Now, if you didn't put molasses in there, did you cook the honey first before you brewed?
No, there was molasses in there. I think there was like blackstrap molasses in there.
Yeah, very prominent. Probably more so than anything else. But as it comes, don't drink this at 32 degrees. Drink this at like 65. That's where it's best. The carbonation is still a little much, although it's calmed down a little bit, allowing me to taste more. But I dig the molasses flavor. I mean, I love molasses. So this has come along nicely once it warmed up, and I poured the rest of it through a sieve. Well, enough about that, guys. Let's move on. We may work on this balance thing for a little bit. And we'll come up with an extended segment because I think it's a pretty important topic when it comes to beer brewing, mead making, anything you're going to ferment in a jug. Let's go on to our Facebook friends. Of course, this is where we try to answer questions with no formal expertise other than what we've learned in our own brew room. So, first off, guys, I want to throw a shout out to, I don't know if you guys got copied on this email or not. Ohad from Israel. He's an avid listener, and he was listening pretty good to that one show that we did about we talked about the honey bush. What was that last episode with Jessica?
Yeah,
I believe from Mountain
Yeah,
Rose.
that was last episode with Jessica. Ohad was telling us about some of his experiences with honeybush here. I can do a brief rundown if you like. I've got a copy of that email in front of me here.
Yeah, go ahead, man. Go ahead.
So he says he's been doing a lot of experimenting for the past 9 months and found one brand of honeybush that was not only his favorite, but also one of the only ones he can get out in Israel. And it's that Numi brand honeybush. If you guys are tea shoppers, you've seen that brand in the store aisles. He says he uses it by infusing it in hot water, covering it, letting it cool naturally over several hours, and then adding the infusion when transferred from primary to secondary, or primary to bottling if he does in bulk age. Says he uses about 2 tea bags per gallon, which is like the maximum amount you want to use. 1 cup of hot water per tea bag. So essentially, he's doing a tea of 1 cup of hot water with 2 tea bags per gallon of mead that he's adding to it. And then he says if you taste the mead right after you add it, you're going to get a lot of honeybush flavor. It's way too distinct. But if you let that sit for a month or two, kind of let that incorporate, you get a really great integration to where the honey aroma and the honeybush aroma play really well together. It's hard to tell them apart. And it also contributes a little bit of body to the mead, which gives it a little bit of a subtle amber hue.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So, again, late editions, guys.
Yep. Thanks, Ohad. We really appreciate it. And keep listening, guy. So let's move on. We had a bunch of Facebook friends we didn't get to last week, and
we mentioned John. We got to get to John.
John,
yeah, let's
yes,
get to John.
We have to get to John. Let's do John first. You got it up there, Ryan?
I did. So this is our pal John. I made a decent braggot over a year ago, which was a standard stout recipe with honey. This year, I decided to change it up, and I called it a malted mead. I used specialty honey, removed the hops, and changed up the grains. I made a 3-gallon test batch with 10 pounds of honey, 2 pounds of steep specialty grains, similar to the end of the process of extract brewing. A bit harsh at first, but after a couple months, it was delicious. I said the way he wrote it. It was delicious. All the best elements of beer and mead, finished at about 13.5% ABV, amazingly drinkable, but trouble's coming. Considering I only steeped 2 pounds of grain and it was more for flavoring than fermentable sugar, is it a mead or a braggot? Well, John, I know JD's gonna kind of comment on what you did there, so I'm just gonna answer your question. We'll go back to what I said here. A mead is a harmonious blend of beer and mead, or beer and honey. And I'm gonna caveat a braggot. Yes. A braggot is a harmonious blend of beer and mead. And I'm gonna caveat that and say, the flavor of it, what I perceive of it, is a harmonious blend. So if you put, 10 pounds of honey and you steeped, 2 pounds of, let's just say chocolate malt or, a roasted malt or something, and and it has those elements of what you're saying, of it has all the best elements of a beer and a mead, then it's a braggot. It is absolutely a braggot. If I'm picking out, this is like a beer and it's like a mead. That to me is a braggot, and that is how the braggot challenge is going to be judged at the Iron Bee. We're not asking for recipes. We're just going to say, does this have the characteristics of beer and mead, and is it enjoyable to drink?
I'm excited, man. I want to talk to John. If we can find out who John is, I'd love to get him on the show, because I want to know how he did this, because that's something that I've been after for a long time, is, being able to bring that honey character out in a stout style braggot, without it overpowering one or the other. The braggot, like Ryan says, it's a harmonious blend. We've laughed and talked it up, here on the show quite a bit. It doesn't mean that you have to take a beer and a braggot and, mix the two in a glass and, that's a braggot. There's no rules to this. Whatever amount of grains you want to incorporate to bring out that maltiness that represents a beer, and then, the honey character along with that. I want to know how he did it. I want to know the grains that he used. I'm excited about what he's done.
I'll tell you, there's a horrible rumor that's going around. I think it's died down a little bit right now, but a horrible rumor that was going around for a while that was saying that a braggot, to be defined as a braggot, had to do with gravity points that came from barley and came from honey, that kind of thing. You need 49% of your gravity points from barley, or 50% of your gravity points from honey, or something like that. No.
Yeah.
No. That's like saying that a melomel has to have certain amount of gravity points from fruit juice. No, it has to taste like it. It's got to incorporate those ingredients and taste like it. I can tell you that if you were, the Mazer Cup is around the corner. I can tell you that if you entered into the Mazer Cup a raspberry mead and a braggot, they're not going to care if there was 1 gravity point that came from raspberry juice, or 99 gravity points that came from malt. They're going to say, does the raspberry mead taste like have raspberries and mead, and does the braggot taste like beer and mead? That's really what you should focus on. Don't worry about where anything else. To say, what is this taste like? What is it presenting like?
That so-called rule is almost as pervasive as Joe's Ancient Orange in the meat community, and just as bad advice to follow.
Yeah. Go ahead.
At the end of the day, you make a beer, you make a mead, you make a mead or a braggot, and it needs to have, as that very famous oft-repeated phrase goes, a harmonious blend of grain, a harmonious blend of beer and mead.
Yeah.
And if you get that with a couple pounds of steeping grain and a ton of honey, with no extract, like you would from one of those extract beer kits, awesome. That's a fantastic application of mead making right there, or braggot making, I should say. There is no hard and fast rule. It's very much still a braggot.
Yeah. He mentions it finished at about 13.5%, but in parentheses he puts amazingly drinkable, but trouble's coming. Dude, you're right on the money with some of the Goose Island stuff. If you've ever had some of their specialty stouts, some of it's like, $15 a bottle, a 12-ounce bottle. Or at least even in a bomber bottle size. But so you're right on the money, dude. I want to know more about it, John. We're going to leave it right here for tonight. Hey, it's been a fun show here this evening, and thanks for listening, hanging out with us here on this episode. Special thanks to Brian Pierce from Yakima Chief Hops. Dude, we're going to have you back on the show again, maybe sooner than you think. But thanks for stopping by. But hey, don't forget, Let us know what you're brewing. We might even give you a call. Email us, info@themeadhouse.com, or send us a message on Facebook or Twitter, both at The Mead House. So in the meantime, happy mead making. That's it for this episode. Brian flipped the lights off. Jeff slammed the door shut. We'll be back in a week with episode 152 of The Mead House. Hey, we're gone.